bring all of that up because when Thomas Campbell comes on the scene, he is an old light, anti-burger, seceder Presbyterian. Right? So the seceders has to do with, they break off from the General Assembly that has become more moderate, more liberal. Right? So they're secession Presbyterians. He is an anti-burger, believing that people shouldn't have to take an oath supporting the religion. And then finally, he is an old light, which had to do with the support of that treaty, which is referred to as the Solemn League Covenant, not something you need to know. But they supported the treaty as a matter of communion. So Campbell wasn't just Presbyterian. He wasn't just a secessionist Presbyterian. He was an old light, anti-burger, seceder Presbyterian. So again, not surprisingly, he feels that maybe there's too much division in Christianity, that's not what Jesus intended when he said, may they all be one. Is to have a group that is old light, anti-burger, seceder Presbyterian, and a new light, And so, of course, you have old lights that are anti-burger and old lights that are burger, and then you have new lights that are anti-burger, right? So
there's a lot going on.
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of division there in Presbyterianism that takes place. So we'll pick that up when we get to the Campbells. A couple other things to talk about as far as not so much specifically religious developments as there are intellectual developments or philosophical developments. One is the influence of a philosopher, kind of a scientist as well, named Francis Bacon. Bacon is really important because he shifts what's beginning to be scientific thinking into developing a new method for investigation where previous generations had looked at, well, let's develop a theory on how something works, and we'll investigate and try to find facts that support that theory. Bacon goes the other way around. So you look at all the facts, right? Let's say you want to look at, I don't know, any scientific thing. You look at all the examples of something. Let's talk about apples. And so you're wanting to do something with apples. So you look at all the different types of apples, and then out of that you draw certain hypotheses. Or if you're wanting to know how plants develop, you would observe a lot of plants, and then after gathering all these facts, you would inductively reason to develop general principles. Now, out of this, a lot of people become very influenced by this, both people interested in science, but then also with religious people as well. That there's a method here for determining truth. That it's not just about science and the natural world, but it could be about religion as well. So Francis Bacon becomes important in this inductive method for determining truth. Also important is John Locke. John Locke emphasized the importance of empiricism, kind of following Francis Bacon, this importance of observation and the development of ideas based on your experience in the world. But he also emphasizes the importance of reason and judgment in examining faith. So particularly for Locke, faith is not necessarily about trusting God or trusting God's promises. For Locke, faith is agreeing to the testimony. Right? And so assenting to the testimony of the eyewitnesses of Scripture. Faith is trusting their testimony as opposed to necessarily just focused on trusting God. And so the emphasis becomes this the use of reason and judgment in matters of faith as opposed to any sort of experiential type of approach to faith. Locke is also important because of his emphasis on toleration in religion. Now, for him particularly, Protestantism, that religion was a matter of conscience, and so no one should be forced to adopt or accept a specific religious position. And all of this, of course, become important for the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, all these individuals who are heavily influenced by John Locke as well. And so he's the one who develops ideas about the consent of the governed, the laws of nature, life, liberty, and for Locke, the pursuit of property being these inalienable rights that human beings have. And of course, Jefferson changes that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The final intellectual development that becomes important in here as well is Scottish common sense philosophy, sometimes referred to as common sense realism. So essentially, this is an attempt to try and provide a foundation for assuming the existence of reality. So Locke and other thinkers emphasized empiricism as being a way in which you understand the world around you, what you observe, what you experience through the senses. But then you have someone like David Hume who becomes very skeptical about all this and even questions the existence of God. But some of these common sense philosophers take Bacon's method and apply it to understandings of reality. There is an obviousness to rationalism in nature. Things are ordered. The planets move in a certain way. The seasons occur in ways that seem to be governed by laws. But they too took Bacon's ideas and emphasized the importance of developing theories based on facts, so that you examine the facts and then develop theories. And out of this comes an approach to Scripture where the Bible is considered to be a storehouse of facts, so that if you want to know the truth about something, the truth about a belief or practice, you examine all of the passages in Scripture that talk about that, and then you draw certain conclusions. So, for example, if you wanted to know what the Bible taught about baptism, for example, you would read all of the passages that talked about baptism in the Bible, and then you would draw out, okay, what are some common themes? What are some, what are some things that appear to be the case in each situation? And that's how you would determine the truth on baptism in this mindset, this influence from Bacon and Locke and from Scottish common sense, which will have a very strong influence on the origins of the Restoration movement, as this is the way that a lot of Protestants in the United States thought about religion in general. And so you find a lot of Protestants talking about this, especially Alexander Campbell and some of those early Restorationist thinkers. Pause there, ask if there's any questions, anything we need to go back and explain. All right, okay. All right, so let's move on to some specific developments within Scots-Irish Christianity that become influential for Restorationists, particularly Alexander Campbell. There's a couple individuals that developed certain forms of Presbyterianism that will eventually split from Presbyterianism that I think are very important in thinking about the rise of Restoration, the Restoration movement in America. First is that established by John Glass. So his father was a minister. He becomes a minister licensed in the Presbyterian Church, but eventually comes to the conviction, like a lot of Protestants, that the Bible should be the sole source of faith and practice. But this is leading him to question some of the ideas of Presbyterianism. And so he's eventually removed from being a preacher. One of the things that he particularly has a problem with is this organization of congregations into synods and presbyteries, believing that each congregation should be autonomous. And so he eventually kind of breaks off and starts a congregational church where the focus, the leadership is just going to be at the local congregation. There were a couple other things that he promoted. One was the idea that the bishop referred to in the New Testament, in the King James, meant the same thing as elder. And so the role of the bishop, the role of the elder were the same thing. So there should be multiple bishops in a local church. Also emphasized the importance of the Lord's Supper being weekly. Okay. It looked like you had a question there. All right. So emphasize the importance of the Lord's Supper weekly, not necessarily something that everybody practiced at that time. Also, out of this, they encouraged people to practice foot washing, the holy kiss. And then also, instead of having local paid ministers, Glass believed that each of the congregations should, the men of those congregations should be responsible for the preaching and the teaching, instead of having somebody who was paid to do that. Sometimes that's referred to as mutual edification. Glass, so Glass starts that movement, and eventually a man named Robert Sandeman, who had been studying for ministry in the Church of Scotland, finds out about Glass, gets to know him, eventually marries Glass's daughter, and will start preaching in these Glassite churches, for lack of a better term. And so he will kind of take Glass's model and then expand it as he moves into London, including things like the weekly Lord's Supper, weekly collection, the plurality of elders, and church discipline. Campbell, Alexander Campbell, when he's in Scotland at the University of Glasgow, studies both Glass and Sandeman and their views. But it's particularly influenced by religious movement started by James and Robert Haldane. They come from an aristocratic family. Robert joins the Navy, but will later become a missionary. James becomes a preacher, but they eventually leave the Church of Scotland to start a Congregationalist movement. So much like John Glass, believing that each congregation should be autonomous, that there shouldn't be this hierarchy of individuals. Essentially, James is the preacher in the Haldane movement. Robert responsible for a lot of the finances. They too emphasize congregational church government and mutual edification, right? So lack of a paid preacher. They prefer immersion instead of sprinkling when it comes to baptism, but it's not something they're dogmatic about. It's not like it's an absolute within the movement. They will also spread. Eventually, an important individual for Campbell, a man named Greville Ewing, will become a part of the Haldane Church, and he'll become a mentor to Alexander Campbell. So through Ewing, Campbell will come in contact with the Haldane's form of Christianity. Ewing, though, disagrees with the Haldanes about immersion, which will also be an area where Campbell and Ewing will disagree as well. So that finishes up our look at European backgrounds. We'll switch now to talk about some things that took place in the United States that are important for thinking about the Restoration movement. So developments in England and Europe are important for how a lot of these people are coming over, but it is in the field of the United States that the Restoration movement really begins and sprouts. So there are a couple things to look at in this context. First is the importance of Puritanism. Puritanism is a movement. I think we've frozen up here. Okay, there we go. It froze up there for a minute. So Puritanism is a movement that is locally influential in New England. It's not any sort of core American tradition, but there are some beliefs that come out of Puritanism that are important for a variety of things. So the Puritans essentially started out of that group of Protestants who flee to Geneva when Mary Tudor becomes the Queen of England. So they go to Geneva, Switzerland, and are influenced by Calvin about Protestantism, and they come back to England when they when Mary dies and Elizabeth starts the reforms back up. But they don't feel that Elizabeth is going far enough. Instead, they feel that there has to be a very strict interpretation of the Bible and a strict interpretation of morality that a lot of other people aren't necessarily following in the Church of England. So, for example, the clergy in the Church of England are still required to wear robes as they perform a variety of services and a variety of worship situations. And the Puritans feel that this is too Catholic, and so they reject it, but they come into contact with that. The Puritans, of course, continue to find themselves in trouble with a variety of rulers after that, sometimes facing persecution, sometimes even having their ears cut off as a punishment. As Puritanism develops in England, and as it tries to bring about these reforms in the Church of England, there are two types of Puritanism that begin to develop. First is the separatist type. The separatist type essentially believed that reform in the Church of England could not take place. So Puritans needed to abandon the Anglican Church and kind of start their own churches. The other type of Puritanism we can call non-separatist. Right? So separatist is the one, non-separatist is the other. The non-separatist type believed that the Anglican Church needed a lot of reform, but they also believed that they could bring about that reform by staying within the Church of England. Eventually, a lot of the non-separatists will also leave the Church of England as well, but there's the idea on the one hand of the separatists, we need to abandon the Church of England. The non-separatists believe that reform could take place.